47 On March 31, 1943, 2nd Lieutenant Owen Bagot watched his B-24 Liberator engulfed in flames tear itself apart over Burma, while 13 Japanese fighters circled for the kill. The 22-year-old co-pilot had been flying combat sorties for 8 months out of Pondicherry, India. His plane, assigned to the 7th Bomb Group's 9th Squadron, carried 8 men toward a railroad bridge at Pinmana when enemy aircraft intercepted them first. The Ki-43 fighters of the Japanese 64th Sentai, nicknamed Oscars by American crews, had launched from airfields flanking the target. Light, agile, lethal and capable hands, these 13 planes climbed through 4,000 feet when they spotted the formation of 12 B-24s. First Lieutenant Lloyd Jensen struggled with the controls as fire consumed the fuel tanks. Oxygen bottles exploded, fueling the blaze. The intercom was dead. Bagot could not communicate verbally with the crew, so he resorted to hand signals. Bail out. Exit immediately. 19-year-old Sergeant Samuel Crostick grabbed 2 fire extinguishers and battled the flames while standing on a catwalk over the open bomb bay. It was futile. The fire was spreading faster than he could suppress it. Jensen gave the order. The crew evacuated the aircraft. Bagot saw 4 parachutes bloom below him before the Liberator detonated. He counted men in the silk canopies. Then came the sound every parachutist fears, the high-pitched whine of enemy fighters diving. The Ki-43s came around for another pass, not at the bombers, but at the men dangling helplessly under their parachutes. American intelligence had documented this tactic. Japanese pilots sometimes strafed airmen to prevent their return to combat. 2 of Bagot's crew were killed mid-air, cut down before reaching the ground. A bullet grazed Bagot's left arm, soaking his flight suit with blood. He made a decision. He went limp, letting his head drop forward, feigning death in the harness, hoping the enemy would disregard a corpse and focus on living targets. The wind spun him slowly as he kept his eyes barely open, watching through slits as one Ki-43 diverged from the others. The fighter pilot was either curious or thorough. The Oscar climbed slightly, then arced back toward Bagot, circling wide to study the American motionless in his parachute. The fighter's nose rose, speed decreased, canopy slid open. Bagot's right hand rested on his leg, gripping his Colt M1911 pistol, standard issue for Army Air Force officers. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. He had never drawn it in combat, never imagined needing it outside survival on the ground. He raised the .45, aimed at the open cockpit. The Japanese pilot noticed the motion. His eyes widened. Bagot fired 4 shots, 4 pulls of the trigger in under 2 seconds. The reports cracked across the sky. The Ki-43's nose pitched downward, engine note altered, and the fighter spiraled out of control. Bagot watched it tumble through 3,000 feet of empty air until it vanished beneath the treeline, swallowed by the jungle. He was still descending, still hanging in his parachute, still bleeding from the graze on his arm. The remaining Ki-43s were still in the sky, and the ground approached rapidly. Bagot landed in a rice paddy 3 miles northeast of Pinmana. The impact drove him to his knees in 18 inches of water. He freed himself from the parachute harness, drew his pistol, and checked the cylinder. 3 rounds left. He scanned the sky. 2 more parachutes were descending half a mile away, Jensen and a gunner, though he could not identify which. The Ki-43s had stopped strafing, climbing northwest back to base. Bagot counted 9 fighters, 4 were missing from the original 13. He did not know whether American gunners had destroyed them or they had run out of fuel and ammunition. He moved toward the treeline bordering the paddy. His arm throbbed where the bullet grazed it, but the bleeding had slowed. He had gone only 20 yards when he heard voices, Burmese, not Japanese. Local militia aligned with the occupying forces. 6 men emerged from the jungle carrying rifles, British Lee Enfield rifles likely captured when Singapore fell the previous year. Bagot raised his hands, pistol still in hand. One of the Burmese gestured at the weapon. Bagot dropped it into the mud. They bound his wrists with rice rope and marched him east. Jensen joined the column 10 minutes later, then Sergeant Crostick, the flight engineer who had fought the Bombay fire. 3 Americans remained, 5 crewmen were dead. Bagot tallied the losses in his mind, forcing himself not to dwell on those cut down midair. The Burmese handed them over to Japanese personnel at a garrison outside Pinmana. Interrogation began immediately. Names, ranks, units, bases, targets, bomb loads, formation sizes. Bagot gave only his name, rank, and serial number. The interrogator struck him across the face, asked again. Bagot repeated the same information. The prisoners were separated. Bagot was confined in a bamboo cage barely large enough to sit upright. No food, no water. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees Fahrenheit by midday. He could hear Jensen nearby but could not see him. Night brought mosquitoes and the distant rumble of artillery to the north. Perhaps the British were pushing back, or perhaps it was wishful thinking. On the 3rd day, Japanese soldiers loaded the 3 Americans onto a transport truck. The convoy traveled south toward Rangoon, moving under cover of darkness to avoid Allied air patrols. Baggett watched the jungle slide past through gaps in the canvas cover, thinking of the Ki-43 spinning down, the pilot's face in that last moment before Baggett pulled the trigger, young, maybe 20, maybe younger. They arrived in Rangoon on April 7, marched through the gates of a military prison on the eastern edge of the city. The compound held 200 prisoners, British, Australian, Indian, and a handful of Americans, most captured during Burma's fall 13 months earlier. They looked like walking skeletons. The British major imprisoned since March 1942 watched Baggett enter the exercise yard, noting his blood-stained flight suit and caked mud on his boots. Word had spread quickly through the camp about the American bomber crew shot down over Pinmanna. Prisoners clamored for details of the sky battle. Baggett could barely believe his own story. The more he replayed the moment in his mind, the more improbable it seemed. A man hanging from a parachute, a pistol, for shots at a moving aircraft. The odds were astronomical. He had seen the Ki-43 fall, but could not confirm whether it truly crashed. Perhaps the pilot recovered from the stall. Perhaps Baggett had missed entirely, and the fighter had simply broken off the attack. The Japanese guards thought differently. On April 15, 8 days after Baggett arrived at Rangoon prison, the guards pulled him from his cell and marched him across the compound. Jensen and another American officer accompanied him. They entered the command dance office. A Japanese major general sat behind a wooden desk. The man commanded all prisoner of war facilities in the Burma theater. He would later be executed as a war criminal for his treatment of Allied prisoners. The general studied Baggett for a full minute without speaking. Then he made an unexpected offer. He explained the concept of harakiri, the honorable way for a warrior to die rather than face the shame of captivity. He offered Baggett a blade and detailed instructions on the proper technique. The general seemed to believe he was showing respect to a fellow soldier who had demonstrated exceptional courage in combat. Baggett declined. He had no intention of committing ritual suicide. The general showed no anger at the refusal. He simply nodded and dismissed the prisoners back to their cells. But the encounter confirmed something Baggett had begun to suspect. The Japanese knew what had happened over Pinmanna. They knew about the Ki-43, and they knew who had brought it down. The guards treated Baggett differently after that meeting. Not better. The beatings and starvation continued, but there was a new element of caution in their behavior. They watched him more carefully, kept him isolated from other prisoners more often. The Japanese military culture placed enormous value on battlefield prowess. Baggett had done something they considered both impossible and admirable. That made him dangerous. By June 1943, Baggett's weight had dropped from 180 pounds to 140. Dysentery swept through the camp. 17 men died in 3 weeks. The Japanese provided no medical care beyond basic bandages and iodine. Prisoners survived on rice, thin vegetable soup, and whatever protein they could scavenge from insects and rats. Baggett developed beriberi from vitamin deficiency. His legs swelled, his vision blurred. In September, the Japanese transferred him and Jensen to a new facility near Singapore. The journey took 4 days by rail and ship. 50 prisoners packed into a cargo hold designed for 20. 2 men died during the voyage. The guards threw their bodies overboard without ceremony. The Singapore camp was worse than Rangoon. Smaller cells, less food, harsher discipline, but it offered one advantage. More Allied prisoners cycled through Singapore on their way to labor camps in Thailand and Malaya. New faces, new information, new rumors about the war's progress. On November 28, 1943, guards brought a new prisoner into the compound, an American colonel, fighter pilot shot down over southern Burma 3 days earlier while flying a P-51 Mustang. His name was Harry Melton, commander of the 311th Fighter Group, and Melton had information about what happened over Pinmanna on March 31. Colonel Harry Melton had been shot down on November 25 while leading an escort mission over the Irrawaddy River Valley. His P-51 took cannon fire from a Ki-43 at 8,000 feet. He bailed out and landed in Japanese-controlled territory near Mktila. Local troops captured him within 2 hours. The Japanese army flew him to Singapore for interrogation before sending him to a permanent prison camp in Japan. Melton spent 3 days in the Singapore facility. The guards kept him separated from other prisoners during initial processing, but he managed brief conversations during exercise periods. He recognized Bagot from intelligence briefings back in India. The 7th Bomb Group's losses over Burma had been significant. Every unit in the theater knew about the March 31st mission to pin Mana. What Melton told Bagot changed everything. During his interrogation in Burma, a Japanese colonel had mentioned the American bomber crew shot down over Pin Mana 8 months earlier. The colonel spoke with a mixture of respect and disbelief. He described how one of the B-24 crewmen had fired at a Ki-43 pilot while hanging in a parachute. The fighter had crashed. The pilot had been thrown clear of the wreckage when it hit the ground. Recovery teams found his body 200 yards from the impact site. The cause of death was a single bullet wound to the head. The Japanese colonel had emphasized that detail. The pilot hadn't died from the crash. The .45 caliber round had killed him before the aircraft hit the trees. The bullet had entered through the left side of his face and exited behind his right ear. The pilot was dead before his Ki-43 began its final spin toward the jungle floor. Melton promised to file an official report when he returned to Allied lines. He wanted Bagot's actions documented. The Army Air Force needed to know that one of their officers had achieved something unprecedented in aerial combat: a kill with a sidearm while suspended beneath a parachute canopy. No fighter escort, no bomber formation, just a man, a pistol, and 4 seconds of perfect aim. But Melton never made that report. On December 14, Japanese guards loaded him and 47 other prisoners onto a transport ship bound for the Japanese home islands. The vessel sailed north through the South China Sea without escort. American submarines controlled those waters by late 1943. The Japanese gambled on speed and luck to get their cargo through. The USS Sea Lion found the transport on December 17 at 0300 hours. The submarine fired 4 torpedoes from 200 yards. 3 hit. The ship broke apart and sank in 11 minutes. Survivors climbed into lifeboats. They spent 2 days adrift before a Japanese destroyer discovered them. The destroyer crew machine-gunned the lifeboats. They killed everyone except one British officer who survived by hiding under corpses until the destroyer departed. That British officer later confirmed Melton's death to the United States War Department. He also recovered a letter Melton had written to his wife while imprisoned in Singapore. The letter mentioned an American pilot who had done something extraordinary over Burma, something the Japanese themselves could barely believe. But the official report about Bagot's pistol shot died with Melton in the South China Sea. The only documented evidence was now a second-hand account from a British survivor and rumors circulating through prisoner of war camps across Southeast Asia. Bagot remained at the Singapore camp through the winter of 1944. By March, his weight had dropped to 110 pounds. His ribs showed through his skin. His teeth loosened from scurvy. The daily ration consisted of a cup of rice and watery soup made from vegetable scraps. Twice a week, the guards provided a small piece of dried fish. Protein was life. Prisoners fought over fish heads and chicken feet when the guards discarded kitchen waste. The work details were worse than the hunger. Japanese engineers used prisoner labor to build airfield defenses around Singapore. Bagot spent 6 months hauling coral stone for revetments and anti-aircraft positions. 12-hour days in 100 degrees heat. Guards beat anyone who slowed down. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion and dysentery. Some didn't get back up. American B-29 superfortresses began hitting targets around Singapore in November 1944. The raids came at night. Bagot watched. From his cell as searchlights stabbed the darkness and anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky. The bombs fell on docks and oil facilities 3 m from the prison. Close enough to feel the concussions, close enough to hope. By January 1945, Bagot's weight had bottomed out at 90 pounds. He could barely walk without assistance. The beriberi had progressed to the point where his legs wouldn't support his weight for more than a few minutes. Jensen helped him to the latrine and back. Other prisoners shared what little extra food they could spare. An Australian sergeant gave Bagot half a lime stolen from a guard's lunch. The vitamin C probably saved his life. The Japanese guards grew more nervous as The war news worsened. Germany surrendered in May. American forces captured Okinawa in June. B-29s firebombed Japanese cities. The Guards stopped pretending the war was going well. Some talked about executing all prisoners if American forces landed in Malaya. Others spoke of forced marches into the jungle where the captives would be abandoned to starve. On August 6, a single B-29 dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Bagot heard the news from a guard who seemed genuinely shaken by what had happened. Japan surrendered on August 15. The guards simply walked away from the camp. They left the gates open and disappeared into Singapore. The prisoners stayed put. Nobody knew if the surrender was real or if this was some kind of trick to justify killing anyone who tried to escape. They waited. On September 21, 8 men parachuted into the prison compound. At dawn, American Office of Strategic Services operatives. They'd been sent to locate and evacuate Allied prisoners before communist insurgents or Japanese holdouts could cause problems. The OSS team brought medical supplies, food, and transport coordination. They documented the prisoners' conditions and began arranging evacuation to India and Australia. 38 men were judged too weak to survive immediate transport. Bagot was among them. The medics set up an aid station in the camp and began treating the most severe cases of malnutrition and disease. On September 28, a C-47 transport landed at Singapore's Kong Airport. The plane carried medical personnel and supplies. It departed 4 hours later with 18 prisoners aboard. Bagot was on that flight. After 917 days in Japanese captivity, he was finally going home. And he carried a story that almost nobody would believe. The C-47 flew Bagot to Kolkata. Army doctors examined him at a field hospital on October 1. Severe malnutrition, beriberi, chronic dysentery, dental damage from scurvy, multiple parasitic infections. They estimated he'd need 6 months to recover enough strength for transport back to the United States. He spent 3 weeks in the Kolkata hospital before transferred to a facility in Karak for additional treatment and rehabilitation. The debriefing began in November. Army Air Force intelligence officers wanted detailed accounts of every prisoner's experience, information about camp locations, guard routines, Japanese military movements, interrogation techniques, anything that might help prosecute war criminals or improve survival training for future aircrews. Bagot provided everything he remembered about Rangoon and Singapore. The interrogators documented his testimony and typed reports that would later support war crimes trials. When he mentioned the Ki-43 over Penmana, the intelligence officers paused. They asked him to repeat the story. Then they asked for clarification on specific details. How far away was the fighter when he fired? What was the aircraft's attitude? How many rounds did he expend? Could he confirm the crash? The questions came rapid fire. Bagot answered each one as precisely as he could. The officers were skeptical, not hostile, just professionally doubtful. They'd heard countless combat stories during the war. Some were accurate, some were embellished, some were completely false, created by men trying to explain survival when their crewmates had died. The intelligence officers needed corroboration, witnesses, physical evidence, anything beyond a single pilot's claim. Bagot had none of that. Jensen had been too far away to see the incident. Crosstick was already on the ground. The other crewmen were dead. Melton was dead. The Japanese colonel's account existed only in Melton's memory, now lost in the South China Sea. There were no gun camera photos because Bagot wasn't in an aircraft. No wreckage recovery because the Ki-43 went down in Japanese-controlled jungle. No way to verify his story through official channels. The intelligence officers filed his report without recommendation. They documented what Bagot claimed but made no judgment about its accuracy. The paperwork went into a folder with thousands of other debriefing reports from returning prisoners. Nobody followed up. Nobody investigated further. The story sat in a filing cabinet at Army Air Force Headquarters and collected dust. Bagot returned to the United States in February 1946. He landed at San Francisco and processed through separation facilities at the Presidio. The doctors cleared him for continued service. His weight had climbed back to 145 pounds. The beriberi symptoms had mostly resolved. He still had nightmares about the camps, still flinched at loud noises, but he was functional, capable of returning to duty. He chose to stay in the military. The Army Air Force became the United States Air Force in September 1947. Baggett transferred seamlessly. He flew transport missions during the Berlin airlift in 1948, served as a squadron operations officer in Japan during the Korean War, earned promotions based on competence and steady performance. Nobody asked him about Pian Mana. The war was over. Everyone wanted to move forward. By 1953, Baggett held the rank of Major. He'd been in uniform for 11 years. The nightmares had faded, but never disappeared completely. Some memories don't let go. The story surfaced occasionally over the years. A fellow officer would hear about Baggett's prisoner of war experience and ask about his shoot-on. Baggett would provide a brief account. Sometimes the officer would press for details about the parachute incident. Baggett would describe what happened as accurately as he could remember. Most listeners reacted with polite skepticism. The story was too extraordinary, too Hollywood. Real combat didn't work that way. Baggett didn't push back. He had no proof, no witnesses who survived the war, no official documentation beyond his initial debriefing report that had concluded nothing. He'd done what he believed he'd done. The Ki-43 had fallen. Whether his shots actually killed the pilot or the plane crashed for some other reason, he couldn't say with absolute certainty. 30 years of distance from the event had introduced doubt even in his own mind. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1961, colonel in 1968. He commanded a transport squadron at Mitchell Air Force Base in New York. His performance reviews praised his leadership and operational competence. He was known for running tight organizations where maintenance standards were high and accident rates were low. He mentored junior officers, sponsored children through the Commander for a Day program, built a reputation as a solid, reliable officer who got results without drama. He retired from the Air Force in 1973 at age 53. 29 years of service. He'd survived the Burma camps, flown through the Berlin airlift, served in Korea, and spent decades building the post-war Air Force into a professional fighting force. He settled in San Antonio, Texas, and took a job as a defense contractor manager. The work was less demanding than military command, but it kept him connected to the aviation industry he'd spent his life serving. His wife knew about Pin Mana. His close friends knew, but Baggett rarely discussed it publicly. The story seemed to belong to a different person. A 22-year-old co-pilot hanging in a parachute over Burma was hard to reconcile with the 60-year-old grandfather living quietly in Texas. The war had been over for 3 decades. Most people didn't want to hear about it anymore. Then, in July 1996, Air Force magazine published an article titled Valor, David, and Goliath. The piece examined Baggett's March 31, 1943 mission in detail. The author had researched Japanese records, interviewed surviving 7th Bomb Group personnel, and analyzed the tactical situation over Pin Mana. The article concluded that despite the lack of direct evidence, Baggett's account was credible based on multiple corroborating factors. No Allied fighters were operating in that area on March 31. The Ki-43's low stall speed made a close approach possible. A .45 caliber round could kill a pilot at 20 feet. The altitude gave the fighter no room to recover from an unintentional stall. Harry Melton's report about the Japanese colonel's statement, though second-hand, came from a credible source. The magazine's evaluation was unequivocal. There seemed to be no reasonable question that Baggett had achieved precisely what he claimed. The feature brought renewed attention. Military history enthusiasts reached out to Baggett. Television producers requested interviews. Aviation periodicals sought follow-up articles. At 76 years old, Baggett found himself recounting Pin Mana to a new generation who had never heard of the Burma campaign or the 7th Bomb Group. He answered their questions, but remained humble about his actions. 4 shots, 1 falling aircraft. 53 years of wondering if it had truly occurred as he remembered. Owen Baggett passed away on July 27, 2006, at his home in New Braunfels, Texas. He was 85. His obituary highlighted his Air Force service, his prisoner of war experience, and his work with children after retirement. It also noted that he was believed to be the only person in military history to shoot down an enemy aircraft with a handgun while parachuting from a stricken bomber. The Colt M1911 pistol he had carried over Burma remained standard issue for American military aviators until the 1980s. The design dated to 1911, John Browning's masterpiece. 7 rounds of .45 caliber stopping power. Reliable in mud, water, sand, and extreme temperatures. Tens of thousands of pilots carried that pistol into combat during World War II, yet only one ever used it to bring down an enemy fighter. The story seems almost unbelievable because the circumstances were extraordinarily specific. A Key 43 had to come close enough for pistol range. The pilot had to raise his canopy. The fighter had to slow nearly to stall speed. The parachutists had to stay conscious and capable of precise fire while injured. All these conditions had to coincide within a 4-second window. The odds were astronomical. Yet astronomical odds are not the same as impossible. Baggett's feat embodies something fundamental about aerial combat in World War II. The men who fought operated at the very limits of human capability. They flew planes barely able to sustain their weight. They fought at altitudes where oxygen deprivation dulled perception. They witnessed comrades die in ways that still seem unimaginable 8 decades later. And occasionally, they survived through actions that defy rational explanation. The Burma campaign, where Baggett served, remains one of the war's least recognized theaters. The 7th Bomb Group flew missions that matched the difficulty of operations over Germany but received only a fraction of the acknowledgement. They struck targets positioned between enemy fighter bases. They flew with minimal fighter escort. They navigated by dead reckoning over jungle terrain that offered no landmarks. By war's end, 30% of 7th Bomb Group crews were killed, captured, or missing. Baggett's story symbolizes their sacrifice and extraordinary bravery under conditions most cannot imagine. If this story of improbable survival moved you, please hit the like button. It genuinely helps more history enthusiasts discover these untold accounts. Subscribe and enable notifications so you never miss another remarkable true story from the war. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you've heard any stories from relatives who served in the Burma campaign or other forgotten theaters of World War II. We read every comment, and your stories matter. Thank you for taking the time to learn about Lieutenant Colonel Owen Baggett. His courage, humility, and refusal to exaggerate his experiences exemplify the finest qualities of the generation that fought World War II. These stories deserve to be remembered. These men deserve to be honored.